Sunlight bounced off the Savannah River, and the calls of an occasional seagull drifted overhead. On the bridge wing, Captain Robert C. Griffin kept an eye on the avian guests, aware of the threat they posed to his dress whites as they dipped low in flight. Scanning the long forecastle of the light cruiser that was his charge, he admired her gun barrels. Coated in new gray paint, they projected firepower and purpose. The first thing visitors saw when they walked past the ship's bow was the bright white 42 painted there. She was named for the city where she was currently tied up. The crew, in their own dress whites, stood in groups, surrounded by laughter and cheer from the locals and guest dignitaries. Boats drifted downriver, horse-drawn carriages clattered on nearby streets, and the sense of the city's famous cuisine wafted from restaurants. Everything spoke of peace and celebration. Some of the men aboard didn't even know they were in Savannah. None of them knew that the fires of war and the fury of combat were about to shatter the illusion of normalcy surrounding the ship's visit, or that the USS Savannah would be in the thick of it. This is her story. With the signing of the London Naval Treaty on April 22, 1930, the U.S. Navy faced a conundrum. It had gained approval to build 7 new, modern light cruisers, as well as 2 of the preceding New Orleans-class heavy cruisers, to replace the aging Omaha class. The pair of heavy cruisers ordered being the USS Quincy and the USS Vincennes, respectively. Potential adversaries such as the Italian Regina Marina and the Imperial Japanese Navy made the replacements essential. The IJN, in particular, had newer and more modern light cruiser designs coming into play. These included the Mogami class, arriving throughout the 1930s. Calling the Mogami cruisers, as originally built, light was a stretch. When it withdrew from the London Treaty, Japan rearmed the ships with larger guns, reclassifying them as heavy cruisers. The U.S. Navy needed to retain power on the sea, but it also needed a flexible class of vessel to perform duties like scouting or even carrier escort, and especially for long-range patrols across 2 oceans. Planning the new ships within the treaty restrictions was harrowing, adding to tonnage considerations, with 1 modified Brooklyn being authorized. The class would carry more main battery guns than any other standard U.S. cruiser, and the newest ship became USS Wichita, which was a bit of an experiment as she had heavy cruiser armaments on a modified Brooklyn hull. She came along with 2 half-sisters, the USS Helena and USS St. Louis. The Helena and the St. Louis were direct results of weight savings from the first 7 Brooklyn-class ships, and although visually similar, did have different internal layouts. They allowed the Navy to replace the first 2 Omaha-class light cruisers under the treaty tonnage limit, which for U.S. cruisers was 323,500. An early decision made use of the capable 6-inch 47 caliber Mark 16 naval guns. Out of the smattering of designs for a new light cruiser class, Design H, featuring a 5-main battery turret layout, was chosen. In the final design, it had 3 turrets forward and 2 aft of the superstructure. An interesting footnote to the Brooklyn's design selection process is that some pretty unconventional ideas were floated. One featured a balanced design with 2 turrets facing forward, 2 aft, and the secondary 5-inch guns mounted in the center of the vessel. Another, Design D, had 3 turrets facing aft and 2 forward. Perhaps the most radical design put all guns forward of the superstructure. The all guns forward configuration recalled the earlier Nelson-class battleships. The USS Savannah's real story began when she was laid down on May 31, 1934, at the New York Shipbuilding Association in Camden, New Jersey. Wartime and ship historians will note that the location was later the birthplace of Big J, the battleship New Jersey. Savannah was launched on May 8, 1937. That confirms she was the first ship of the class to be laid down and the 4th to be launched. She was fully completed on March 10, 1938. Her dimensions were as follows. In length, she was 608 feet 4 inches. At the beam, she was 61 feet 9 inches. She displaced 9,767 tons standard. Fully loaded, that was 12,207 tons. She drew a draft of 22 feet 9 inches. Savannah was powered with a capable array of Babcock and Wilcox boilers. Sources list them as generating between 100,000 to 107,000 shaft horsepower. Her 4 shafts carried 3 bladed bronze propellers. That arrangement allowed the ships of the Brooklyn class as built to reach a speed of around 32.5 knots. The potential for speed would greatly aid the ships in the battles to come. With today's historical hindsight, Savannah's early peacetime career looks almost postcard perfect. In the late 1930s, she made several foreign trips. The first showed the stars and stripes on her shakedown cruise to Cuba, then over to Haiti to work up her machinery and familiarize the crew with the new vessel. Throughout that time, Captain Robert C. Griffin remained in command. Savannah returned to Philadelphia on June 3rd to assess feedback from the shakedown cruise. Her final trials took place off the coast of Rockland, Maine. By then, world events were beginning to look ominous. As storm clouds gathered over Europe, the U.S. Navy acknowledged that ships just like Savannah, with her speed and flexible capabilities, would be vital in protecting American citizens outside the country should hostilities break out. Savannah, practically brand new, and one of the U.S. Navy's most modern light cruisers, steamed from Philadelphia to Portsmouth, England on the 26th of September 1938. She arrived on the 4th of October, following the conclusion of the Munich Conference, where diplomacy attempted to quell a worsening political scenario in Europe. Savannah then returned to Norfolk, Virginia, bouncing down to the warm waters of the Caribbean for winter maneuvers. Maneuvers completed, she made the first of 2 trips to her namesake city of Savannah, Georgia on April 12th to April 20th, 1939. Even today, there is a powerful sense of history that clings to the riverfront where the ship was moored. Over the next several months, Savannah transited the Panama Canal to the U.S. West Coast. After a stop in San Diego, California, she arrived in Pearl Harbor in May of 1940. By then, Savannah was already quite a world traveler. At Pearl Harbor, she received a new skipper, Andrew C. Bennett. Savannah bounced between U.S. ports from Hawaii to the West Coast in those early years of her life. After a brief overhaul at Mare Island Navy Yard on scenic Francisco Bay, she returned to Hawaii. There, she participated in various training exercises for her and for her crew. Before long, she transited back through the Panama Canal and visited the by then familiar waters of the Caribbean. There, she made a stop at Cuba, arriving on June 17, 1940. War in Europe had been raging since the 9th of September 1939. Savannah was moved to be the flagship of Cruiser Division 8. She then stretched her legs during neutrality patrols. Those ranged from the sunny latitudes of the Caribbean all the way up to the cold waters off Newfoundland. She once even acted as a screen for the later famous USS Wasp, as well as escorting British merchant vessels up to within a few hundred nautical miles of the British Isles. During that interval in 1940, the U.S. was not officially at war. Operations like those Savannah carried out were opportunities for vessels like her to hone their skills in escort duty, just one of the many uses for a capable light cruiser such as Savannah. Researching Savannah's early career opens a window to how her crew felt sailing the new cruiser. Making the transit from Philadelphia to Portsmouth, England in 1938, the still almost new vessel was hit with a powerful gale-force storm. Despite the conditions, it was mentioned in the logs. One entry reads, quote, "The ship rode easily and was dry on deck. The battery could have worked easily. The period was 14 to 15 seconds with a smooth, easy roll," end quote. In a separate storm during one of her transits through the English Channel, she encountered a severe storm of 65 to 70 knot winds. The ship was logged as, quote, "Wet with spray, she rolled deeply but easily," end quote. Upon clearing, the log states, quote, "The battery could have been used," end quote. Though storms tested Savannah, the results showed her to be a fine gunboat. During the pre-war period, Savannah's gun crew did a lot of training, eventually setting a gunnery record by firing 136 6-inch rounds in 60 seconds from her 15 main battery guns. A complex set of tasks were needed to put out that rate of fire, from the gunnery officers all the way down to the chief petty officers and the most junior enlisted sailors. The tempo and mood in her gunnery and ammunition spaces had to be calm, professional, and organized. Readying the ammunition for firing, loading the ammunition hoist, making adjustments of the guns, the scene on Savannah had to be anything but chaotic. In review, Savannah's entire career displays the crew's professionalism, with a consistent reputation of fine seamanship from each division. The superior training and competence of Savannah's crew not only accompanied her throughout her career, it saved the ship in the war to come. Raising crew and vessel skills was a fleet-wide initiative. In Savannah's early career, she participated in the Navy's Fleet Problem Exercise 20. Fleet problem exercises were performed to develop and refine tactics and improve the interoperational capacity of fleet formations. Savannah participated in Exercise 20 from the 1st of April through May 7, 1940. The exercises took place around the Hawaiian Islands and Eastern Pacific. That operation turned out to be incredibly useful for the carrier crews involved. One interesting result was spotting the need to improve mission tasking for U.S. carrier squadrons, as well as other operations areas needing improvement. Savannah's pre-war career yields many more interesting details beyond these highlights. A serious researcher could produce hours of video on that period of her history alone. That said, this video essay moves into the next and most notable phase of Savannah's career, the Second World War. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comments section below. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the U.S. military forces based in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii were attacked. America's illusion of peace was definitively shattered. At the time of the attack, Savannah was 5 hours ahead in New York Harbor. She had been idling for a short while in the New York Navy Yard, following voyage repairs. The outbreak of war scrambled ships throughout the U.S. Navy. Following the previous several years of training evolutions and quality sea time, Savannah quickly put to sea. She sailed for Casco Bay, then made for Bermuda with Task Group 2.7. There, she would screen and escort for the aircraft carrier USS Ranger. Ranger was to conduct flight training operations on Christmas Eve later that same month. It's important to note that Savannah's weaponry by that time had undergone a round of minor modifications. By the spring of 1942, her original complement of weapons would include 15 of the venerable 6-inch 47 caliber main guns and 8 5-inch secondary guns. The last were of an older type when compared to weapons like the 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns synonymous with World War II U.S. warships. Savannah also carried 2 single 3-inch mounts and a smattering of 12 20mm weapons. She retained her 50 caliber machine guns, water-cooled according to the builder's model. During late 1941 through much of 1942, Savannah's life consisted of escort. Following France's surrender to the Germans, Savannah patrolled against possible Vicky French warship activity. As well, she was committed to readiness exercises and another overhaul for her propellers that time. It was not until Operation Torch in November of 1942 that Savannah finally got the chance to bloody her guns. As the war in the Mediterranean heated up, she would prove no stranger there. Firing against Vicky French shore positions along the Moroccan coast, she teamed up with some famous names, including the USS Texas of later D-Day fame. On November 8, 1942, she blasted shore positions and supported with gunfire the hasty falling back of USS Roe. Never one to turn away from a fight, Savannah went on to several duels with French shore artillery positions. She suppressed French batteries, only to discover that the enemy gun crews were temporarily silent. Once the naval bombardment stopped, the silenced French guns once more opened fire. Savannah put her reputation for smooth gunnery to the test that day, firing over 1,196 main battery 6-inch rounds, along with 406 of her secondary 5-inch rounds. Words and numbers cannot really describe the action, but they represent shooting matches between shore installations and Allied ships like Savannah, which provided naval gunfire support. Shore bombardment is often visualized as a one-sided affair, where the warships involved fire unopposed. That was not the case on November 8th. The enemy was definitely engaged and shooting back. The French ship Jean Bart and the USS Massachusetts fought a similar gunnery duel down the coast during the Battle of Casablanca at very nearly the same date. On the 9th of November, Savannah scored a direct hit on one of the enemy's shore batteries. The hit destroyed a 138.6 gun defending the Casbah fortress and Mahdia of Morocco, which guarded the mouth of the Cebu River. Incredibly brave actions by naval liaison officers who directed Savannah's gunfire for the American ground forces around the fortress led to the repulsing of a French armored counterattack. The French, using R-35 light tanks, were a grave threat to the landed Allied forces in the vicinity. The next day, November 10th, Savannah supported an epic delivery of raider troops on the USS Dallas, right under the nose of the Casbah fortress. Credit must be given where due to the French gunners defending the estuary. Contrary to modern memes of poor French fighting capacity during the conflict, the French subjected the men on board Dallas to a withering array of machine gun and 75mm emplaced gunfire. Savannah, never one to shy away from the action, returned fire, expending over 892 6-inch rounds and firing over 236 5-inch rounds in that one engagement. Even with all the carnage, Savannah was not content to rely solely on gunfire. Her scout planes went into play. One was recorded hitting a French shore 75mm gun emplacement with depth charges. A War Thunder Naval Forces moment, but in real combat. Savannah and her crew tucked still another feather in their caps during the same engagement. Covering Dallas, one of Savannah's secondary 5-inch guns touched off a French ammunition depot. The effect was deafening. Her scout planes went on to spot several other French positions and aid the operation. The USS Dallas, battered but afloat, delivered her raider cargo to waiting Allied troops ashore. That helped to earn the Dallas a Presidential Unit Citation, not too shabby a distinction for a small four-stacker laid down in 1918. As the operation came to a close, a ceasefire was signed, fittingly enough, on November 11th, Armistice Day. Savannah, USS Texas, and friends set sail for home, along with 7 destroyers. Savannah, in the following weeks, operated multiple variants of scout aircraft, especially variants of the Curtiss SOC Seagull. While Savannah's brave flight crews were developing new attack methods against ground targets, Germany, an ocean away, was creating a novel weapon. Like the aircraft carrier did for battle at sea, the German weapon would transform how munitions were used in aerial warfare. Still riding high from her victory during Operation Torch, and busy with meeting wartime requirements, the Savannah's crew was unaware their ship would be tested to the limit by a new and deadly tool in the hands of the enemy. Far from U.S. shores and the waters of the Caribbean, a weapon was being readied for deployment. Its origins were rooted in the First World War, with the advent of radio-controlled craft such as Britain's Ruston Proctor aerial target and America's Kettering aerial torpedo. Those projects can, in turn, be viewed as precursors to modern technologies such as cruise missiles or drones. Proofs of the concept that weapons could be guided by radio were laid down by the World War I-era projects. During the interwar years, the technology was refined by various nations that continued working on it. By the Second World War, Germany had one of the most developed guided munitions programs. As with U.S. Army Air Force's General Billy Mitchell, who rallied for tests proving warships could be sunk with air power, the Germans, by 1943, were pressured to address increasing Allied naval pressure along the shores of occupied Europe and North Africa. Successful Allied landings were taking place in North Africa, with Sicily and Italy being the next logical targets. Germany sought to deploy an asymmetrical response to an overwhelming Allied naval presence. The German surface fleet was, by that time, largely ineffective. Passing by British-held Gibraltar was very difficult for even the most daring U-boat commanders. A decision to use radio-guided weapons to more accurately strike warships was activated, with 2 models of radio-controlled bombs launched from bomber aircraft. The models were the Henschel HS-293 and the soon-to-be infamous Ruhrstahl X-1, simply known as the Fritz X. To focus on the latter, it was a glide bomb and was used to a great effect during the fighting around Italy, where it struck many Allied vessels during the campaigns there. The weapons were typically deployed from German Dornier Do 217 bombers. Research indicates that 2 Luftwaffe bomber wings were qualified to deploy them in combat, but other Luftwaffe wings, along with a variety of other aircraft, would sporadically deploy the weapons piecemeal. The main bomber wings appear to have been the Kampfgeschwader 100, and the Kampfgeschwader 40. The story of the Fritz X began in 1939 with testing at the Peenemünde Special Weapons Facility. In Freedom units, the weapon was 11 feet long, weighed over 3,000 pounds, and employed a 700-pound warhead. It was equipped with cruciform wings, which measured 55 inches. Dropped from 20,000 feet, the weapons could achieve transonic speeds up to 700 miles per hour. With special training, the mothership, that is, the bomber dropping the weapon, would drop the weapon, pull up 1,000 feet in altitude, and reduce throttle. That allowed the bombardier in the aircraft to better guide the glide bomb to its target. Using its kinetic energy and large warhead, the weapon could, in theory, penetrate all known warship deck armor at the time. To aid in the aiming process, the bombardier could track the weapon from a flare placed on the tail of the bomb. Although the flare was often used, as crews gained more experience and wartime necessity crept in, not all Fritz X bombs were used with the flares installed. On August 29, 1943, the modern Italian battleship Roma was the first victim of this terrifying weapon. She was underway and at sea, an important maneuver to avoid traditional air attack. Unfortunately, for the crew of the Roma, the new weapons worked as they were designed and were guided directly to their target. The first weapon hit the starboard side of Roma, penetrating down to her engineering spaces, detonating below the ship. Boilers and electrical equipment were disabled. With the ship down to 2 shafts, the second bomb then hit, penetrating through her deck and detonating in her forward engine room. That one is thought to have caused a secondary explosion in one of the main battery magazines. The blast tossed one of Roma's 15-inch gun turrets into the air and crippled the ship. Roma sank, with over 1,300 Italian crew members going down with her. Her wreck was found in June 2012 and showed the extent of the damage from the attack. For perspective, Roma had over 162 millimeters of deck armor, or roughly 6 inches, not including the various decks below the main armor deck that had to have been penetrated to cause the type of damage that sank her. This was one of the first attacks against a naval vessel using guided weapons in military history. For Savannah, what came next turned out to be the highlight of her wartime service, as well as a desperate fight for survival. On September 3, 1943, Major General Walter Bendel Smith, representing the Allies, and Brigade General Giuseppe Castellano, representing Italian forces, signed the terms of armistice. The signing effectively removed Italy from the war. The men of Savannah heard about the signing at around 18:30 in the evening on September 8th, while underway to relieve sister ship USS Boise's position in her prospective fire support group. For the crew on board the Savannah, the relief was welcome but short-lived. The Germans wasted no time in their Fallachse, or case access plans. Those dictated the German occupation of surrendered Italian positions and the seizure of Italian war materials. The Italians at large had surrendered, but the fighting against the Germans in Italy was far from over. For Savannah, the battle ahead was none other than Operation Avalanche, the Allied landings at the Gulf of Salerno. During that time frame, she was under the command of Captain Robert Webster Carey. The ship left from Mer el-Kabir along with the invasion force on 5th of September, following news of the armistice. By 1905 on the 8th, she was at general quarters. The preceding several weeks had been spent training, not only with Savannah's own crew, but with the brave men of the shore fire control parties. The SFCPs, a combination of both naval and army personnel, would be counted on to direct Savannah's firepower to targets ashore. Savannah's war service had been steady, but thus far she had escaped serious damage, even after one engagement in which her SCR-522A5 fighter voice director radio failed. The crew, being ever so adaptable, used clothesline to tie up the broken transmitters. Her captain noted the crew's, quote, conduct and discipline as excellent. Performance like that was in line with Savannah's reputation of cool professionalism during combat. On the 8th of September, she spent the early night slipping through enemy minefields, streaming paravanes to disable mines. At 2,000 hours, she came under air attack from Luftwaffe aircraft escorting tank landing and supply ships, and carrying torpedoes. The sky lit up with heavy anti-aircraft fire and flares as Allied ships responded. Sources on the engagement vary in their reports, but it's credible that 5 or 6 German aircraft, likely Ju-88s, were shot down. Savannah entered Salerno Bay just before midnight on the 8th, along with the other ships in the Allied landing force. Throughout the following day, Savannah assisted in escort and patrol duty as the operation proceeded. The entire time, her crew remained at the ready and the ship was on the watch for a variety of threats, from U-boats to following up Luftwaffe air attacks. Some bomb splashes were too close for comfort, ranging from 500 to 1,000 yards from the ship. Air attacks on the 9th were largely repelled by Allied fighters and anti-aircraft fire, but the Germans were not finished with the Allied fleet just yet. Throughout the day, Savannah engaged in several shore bombardment actions, even taking out a rail-mounted artillery piece in the morning. German air activity continued, with aerial engagements breaking out between Allied and German fighters. From firing at German panzers to counter-battery fire against enemy shore batteries, Savannah worked at what she did so well, door-dashing an assortment of high-explosive menu options from ship to shore for hungry German positions. Savannah garnered praise from the assistant commander of the U.S. 36th Infantry Division for her performance during the bombardment, also for dodging German air attacks the next day on the 10th, and alongside the USS Philadelphia and accompanying destroyers, for her gunfire support. Once more, also alongside the Philadelphia, her scout planes came into play. The efforts of those brave flight crews cannot be overstated. They often were the eyes that discovered enemy formations first. The Luftwaffe attacks continued. News arrived from the cryptanalyst ship USS Ancon in the form of an intercepted German message. The report indicated that the Germans intended to focus their air attacks against specific ships, including the Savannah, the following day. Savannah's anti-aircraft crews were beginning to show signs of exhaustion. Constantly on watch for further attacks, they gazed up from their gun tubs in the early hours of the 11th. In the darkness of the bay, red and white flares dropped by the Germans illuminated the Gulf. Aircraft engines were heard. One can now only guess what it would have been like. Men worn out and constantly on edge, hearing the enemy approach in the dark. In the red and white glow cutting through the darkness of the early morning, Savannah replied. Her 5-inch secondaries, 40mm and 20mm weapons roared to life. Her gunners, although exhausted, put up a concentrated rain of fire. Her gun crews pushed through fatigue to handle and feed the weapons in the darkness. Savannah's fire kept the enemy at bay. The German interlopers could only drop sporadic bombs, none within range to damage the ship. Amid the scene of tracers, gun smoke, and the rattling of shell casings, the crew readied themselves for yet another day supporting Allied ground forces in need. For the Germans, their flares revealed a target that needed to be removed from the fight for their own counterattacking forces along the invasion front. The stage was set. The morning of the 11th of September started off with deceptive calm. Sunlight shone on the mild waters off Salerno. Conditions were clear with a localized haze over Savannah's part of the bay. As the anti-aircraft guns swiveled in their mounts, binoculars scanned the sky. The gunners, mates, and ammunition handlers were prepared, extra rounds being readied by their gun stations for the inevitable enemy action. Far from the bay, the German Do-17 bombers sputtered into life. The airmen were calm and precise as they checked their aircraft systems. One by one, the bombers taxied onto the runway of the airfield. One bomber, in particular, readied in the takeoff pattern. The pilot gripped his controls for another sortie. The plane rattled as it bent and flexed under the weight of its payload, then garnered speed down the runway. The aircrew watched as the trees and dirt pathways surrounding the airfield drifted by below them. On Savannah, it was combat operations once more. Her crew had been at general quarters almost continuously since September 8th. During all that time, men lived, ate, and if possible, got what rest they could. All done at their stations between bouts of combat. At 9:30 that morning, Savannah found herself nestled between some of the transports of the landing fleet. Allied forces ashore at that time approached her maximum gun range. Enemy artillery threats had waned a bit, but the ship's maneuvering was still mindful of unlocated mines. Then, news of enemy aircraft movements arrived once again from USS Ancon. The Ancon was busy relaying information about a group of 58 German bombers that had been driven off by a combination of Allied fighters and naval anti-aircraft fire. It was clear to the Allied ships in the vicinity that the Germans were not giving up their aerial assault. Acting on reports of German fighter aircraft heading toward Savannah's position from the south, she increased her speed from within the crowded invasion area. While delicately making her way between other Allied vessels, room for evasive maneuver would be limited. At about a quarter before 1000 hours, anti-aircraft spotters on board Savannah spotted a lone German bomber. The aircraft was a Dornier 217E-5E, specially equipped to deliver guided bombs. The weapon was the already mentioned Rohrstahl X-1 guided glide bomb. The bomber was high overhead, with the light of the sun behind it. The bomber crew had to slip past a flight of American P-38 fighters sent to intercept the plane. Down below, Savannah's directors and gunners tracked the plane, but the altitude of the target didn't make that task easy. The German bomber crew opened bomb bay doors and released their weapon at an altitude of roughly 18,700 feet. That was much higher than the bombs dropped on battleship Roma, giving the weapon and the bomb aimer plenty of time to guide the bomb, in this case, flare-equipped, down to the target. From the perspective of the German bomber crew, Savannah would undoubtedly have appeared like a long, thin pencil among the larger, plump transports. The Germans knew that the gunfire support of the Allied warships was causing heavy casualties in their own forces behind the landing areas. For the bomber crew attacking Savannah, it would have seemed essential to relieve the pressure on their comrades in their fight against the Allied landing forces down below. The moments would have ticked by, the crew of the light cruisers watching as the single weapon fell, at first silently, toward them. Some of the observers, looking through their optical instruments, would have sighted the trail of smoke from the guidance flare. With the heavy air combat overhead for the past several days, some observers later stated that they thought the German bomb was just another failing downed aircraft. Other survivor accounts noted a subtle sound right before contact with the ship, a rushing of air or a whooshing sound. The impact was anything but subtle. Almost instantly, the over 3,000-pound weapon slammed into the roof of Turret 3. The punch went clean through the 2 inches of roof armor at a right-to-left angle of around 20 degrees. Fractions of a second later, the warhead exploded much lower in an ammunition handling space. The blast continued out the bottom of the ship on the port side, causing significant damage. Of the men in the barbette of Turret 3, a dozen were killed instantly. On the main deck, men on the bridge level were knocked off their feet. Debris from life-saving equipment, such as the raft stored on top of the turrets, spilled over the carnage along the main deck. Below, in the affected magazine handling spaces, fires were extinguished by the inflow of water when the shockwave from the explosion tore open seams. Just below the port armor belt, the split measured over 10 of the ship's frames, 41 to 52. Boilers in the ship's engineering spaces were blown out. In Fire Room Number 1, smoke from the damage began to pour in. In Fire Room Number 2, water levels for the machinery was low. In the other 2 fire rooms, oil pressure was lost completely for a brief period. Research documents extensive damage done to watertight doors, along with extensive flooding forward. One source stated that over 152 feet of Savannah suffered from some sort of flooding. That in a ship whose length was just over 600 feet. Damage of that magnitude would be almost fatal for nearly any vessel. The carnage did not end there. In the forward magazine spaces for turret number 1, which was farthest forward, fire and smoke damage spread. More damage took place throughout the ship from the shock of the impact and subsequent explosion. Among the fallen, a damage control team were killed instantly. The bomb, with its 700-pound warhead, had penetrated and detonated exactly as it was designed to do. Savannah, however, was far different from Roma. In the moments after the impact, her surviving crew immediately got to their feet and the fight began to save their ship. The surviving crewmen, in many cases stepping over their fallen shipmates, got to work. A fire rolled thick smoke out of the gaping wound on the top of Turret 3. The black, rolling smoke itself was toxic. Anyone caught in it would turn into another casualty. Back down below, between bulkheads 21 through 61, seawater poured in, rapidly flooding those areas. The ship's gyros were not responding. Water as deep as 4 feet was reported in areas of 3 deck. The ship by then was virtually dead in the water. Photographs amazingly taken from on board after the attack of Turret 3 show one of Savannah's gun barrels depressed down, toward the main deck. All electrical power was also out in the immediate aftermath of the bomb. USS Philadelphia, still nearby, dodged another Fritz X, suffering only minor damage from her near miss that day. The men on board Philadelphia had to have experienced turbulent emotions, seeing the damage done to their sister ship and knowing the plight of their fellow sailors on board Savannah. Back on CL-42, battery-powered emergency lanterns were switched on. The dead that were in passages that needed clearing were brought out on deck. Gasoline-powered pumps, known as handy billies, 5 in total, were used to get the fires under control roughly 15 minutes later. Totally extinguishing the flames took another 2 hours. Steering was switched over to emergency steering aft. During the damage control operations, what is thought to be at least 2 main battery 6-inch shells touched off a secondary explosion and damaged turret number 3. Water poured into the turret spaces up to shell deck level, and the explosion knocked over one of the men fighting the flames there. The battle to restore electrical power was also well underway. Not smoke, nor flame, nor even secondary explosions stopped Savannah's crew from completing that task. It is shocking to imagine conditions down below around the turrets. Black smoke searing lungs, eyes burning, skin burning too, as hands touched a hot bulkhead, feet sloshing in the darkness in oily seawater. The men fighting the flames in these spaces merit the deepest awe and respect. The men of Savannah did not have any historical hindsight to let them know if their efforts were successful or not. For them, combat was truly life or death. There was no guarantee that they could save their ship, thus preventing even greater loss of life. They had no way to know their ship would go down in history as receiving the largest hit from a guided bomb on a U.S. warship during World War II, or that their cruiser would go on to become perhaps the most heavily modernized out of the Brooklyns in the war. Researchers of the modern era can lose themselves in notes and factual references. But for the crew that was there, saving their shipmates was surely the only thing that mattered. That message is chillingly evident in the images from the photographs who happened to be on board Savannah that fateful day when she took such a grievous hit. Another profound message is embedded in the awards given out, and in the reading of the names of the men to whom they were given. A Navy Cross, a Legion of Merit, a Silver Star. But heroism goes beyond the stories preserved to the present day. Words can never truly convey what must have been seen or experienced by Savannah, especially when the research is trying to uncover that 80-plus years after the fact. Viewers who would like a shorter piece done on the stories of valor and human determination during Savannah's fight that day should contact the presenter. Back on board Savannah, by 11:08, her anchor splashed down as she came to a stop in the transport area. Steam had been restored to the main plant and electrical power was operational, excluding the areas of damage. 2 tugs, Hopi and Marin, came alongside to assist in pumping out water from her flooded compartments. A diver was sent below that afternoon and confirmed the extent of the damage under her port side. Although severe, a combination of Savannah's rugged construction and the crew's valiant damage control efforts had pulled her through. The calm, professional, and quick-to-act attitude and culture of her crew cannot be overstated. They are undoubtedly the reasons she survived. Official totals for the dead in the attack vary between sources, but the ship's company lost around 197 to 200 sailors that day. In the somber evening hours on the 11th, when Savannah headed for repairs at the island of Malta, a pair of destroyers took up escort. Philadelphia took up position 2, steaming with her stricken sister until the early morning hours the following day. News of Savannah's casualties had surely reached the other ships by then. One can only imagine the conversations among crewmen on those ships as they looked upon her and knew what had transpired. Down below, among Savannah's engineering crew, the fight to bring her boilers back online carried on for over 8 hours. Finally, they were able to relight all boilers. Eventually, the ship was able to reach 18 knots under her own power on her way to Malta. 4 sailors trapped in the emergency radio room were not drilled out until the night of September 13th. The ordeal marks the high point of Savannah's wartime career, although the engagement would not be the end of her wartime service. Allied naval commanders went on to examine the effects of the Fritz X as other ships fell victims, the HMS Uganda and the legendary HMS Warspite among them, until the war's end. For Savannah, although she was well constructed, one fact was incontestable. She was a light cruiser, not constructed with heavy armored bulkheads like the battleship Roma. The bomb was designed to penetrate thick armor, with modern Allied heavy cruisers and battleships in mind. Contrary to popular depictions in film and media, a bomb like that is an actual machine itself, meant to penetrate thick armored decks and explode, preferably inside the target vessel. Its purpose was to cause maximum damages, not just detonate on contact. In Savannah's case, even the US Navy was surprised that her affected magazine spaces did not detonate. The bomb, while exploding, largely passed through Savannah, at a rough speed of 600 to 700 miles per hour, hence the large hole in the bottom of the ship. All things considered, the ship still suffered heavy damage. That bloody chapter in her history was finally at an end, but her war service continued. Thank you so much to our amazing YouTube members and patrons. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Following her battle damage at Salerno, Savannah underwent a set of repairs to get her in shape for a return to the United States. Those wrapped at Valletta on December 3rd of 1943. A pleasant turn of events for her crew put her back in Philadelphia right before the new year. That allowed her crew to partake in some well-needed and deserved leave with their families for the holiday. The stories Savannah's young sailors carried home to their families from their time in the sunny Mediterranean must have been, to say the least, interesting. The ship's battle damage was still severe and had to be addressed. Workers conducted repairs and modernized the ship from February 27th through to April 1944. That yard period for Savannah drastically changed her appearance. Work on her main battery swapped out 2 of her 6-inch turrets, turrets 1 and 2, for 2 of USS Boise's old turrets from that ship's yard period. Her radar sets were replaced and updated, and other key changes were made, such as removing her older 5-inch single mounts. Her secondary battery was replaced with the much more capable 5-inch 38 dual-purpose twin mounts. She also had a blister installed alongside the hull to increase her stability. Despite all the repairs and refitting, problems persisted for the rest of her career, with leakages in the areas of the ship where the work was performed. The positive result was that Savannah now had even more capable anti-aircraft capability, as well as much-needed work on her engines, boilers, and propulsion systems. She gained weapons like the 5-inch 38s and the US deploying devices, such as variable timed fuses for weapons like the 40mm Bofors mounts. For anyone with even a basic understanding of US naval vessels during the Second World War, one thing stands out: the quite necessary emphasis on anti-aircraft capability. On Savannah, her total armament put even many Axis battleships to shame when it came to her ability to throw steel into the sky. On August 15th, a new crew arrived on board the rebuilt Savannah, who sported her Measure 22 camouflage pattern. Over the next month, she underwent a variety of tests of her new systems. She topped off supplies and spent several weeks checking her new weapons and radars, along with putting her engines through their paces. That period also gave the incoming crew members time to become familiar with their home for the time being. On September 11, 1944, a memorial was held for the fallen from the Battle of Salerno the year prior. When the 19 salvos were fired in honor of the men at Salerno, the new crew must have surely felt they had very large shoes to fill. By 1945, the war in Europe was drawing to a final climactic end, with Italy out of the war and Germany on the back foot. Groundwork for the post-war world was already being laid by the Allied powers and their Soviet partners. A meeting in Yalta, on the shores of Crimea, was planned to bring together the heads of state of the US, UK, and USSR. Between February 4th and February 11th of 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Secretary General Joseph Stalin met in Yalta to discuss the division of post-war Germany. Savannah, with other ships of Tu 21.5.4, took part in the escort of President Roosevelt. She, along with the other ships in her group, went on to meet up with another group, TG 29.9, on January 27th. One interesting event involving Savannah took place during the relief of TG 21.5 ships on the 29th. Detecting what they thought to be U-boats on their sound gear, it was quickly discovered that the enemy vessels were no more than schools of fish. After assisting in bathing Bikini Bottom with sonar waves, Savannah and the other vessels continued their mission. Savannah trailed USS Quincy through the Straits of Gibraltar, escorting the president to Malta for a preliminary conference with Prime Minister Churchill. Sailing directly aft of the heavy cruiser, Savannah followed Quincy, which carried Roosevelt into Malta on February 2nd. Research reveals an interesting note about Savannah's time in Malta. Material provided by the Roosevelt Library constitutes a snapshot of the day-to-day lives of the crew of various vessels at anchor there. Photographs show the butchering of animals on the fantail of USS Murphy for meals provided to visiting dignitaries, the whole business taking place under sunny Mediterranean skies. Reading through the logs of the time, one finds the mundane weather reports. Temperatures and conditions, of course, but also the transfers of dignitaries between ships. Shelters being erected for shade on Murphy's fantail. Guests dining with the president. British Admiral Cunningham's arrival. All those as well as many more ordinary everyday events on and between the ships present at Malta. The logs give a lively and detailed view of life aboard an Allied naval vessel outside of combat during the war, a view that stays with anyone reading them. The Yalta Conference ended on February 11, 1945. By then, Savannah's fate for the rest of her wartime service was already being discussed back in the U.S. Admiral King, in particular, earmarked her, with her heavily upgraded equipment such as radars and weapons, for a training role for new crews of the more modern U.S. cruisers coming online. Much of that gear was standard on newer cruiser classes such as the Cleveland's and Baltimore classes. Savannah went on to fulfill that role very well, spending the remainder of the war largely performing training operations. There are many more dates of interest in Savannah's logs of the period. Most show day-to-day reports on things like weather, speed, and so on. But one story stands out, related during a visit to the Ships of the Sea Museum in Savannah, Georgia. While transiting down to the Caribbean in the summer of 1945, with Germany by then defeated, the crew was allowed to temporarily lift wartime lighting restrictions. As the story went, a film projector was set up one evening at sea with movies played on a screen on the ship's fantail. The scene, if it can be relived, displays the return to somewhat normal life for a crew and a country tired of war. One can visualize Savannah cutting through the fading sunlight and balmy Caribbean waters, her lights finally shining bright as the world was changing drastically around her. Japan's formal surrender to the Allies took place a short time later, on September 2nd. Savannah was, by then, an outdated vessel in the context of the U.S. Navy. The Navy's growing needs called for ships with more reserve weight to accommodate heavier and more modern weapons and equipment. Savannah found herself with one last mission in service to her country, participating in Operation Magic Carpet, a massive undertaking to facilitate the return of U.S. forces from theaters of operation in Europe and the Pacific. The operation involved ships of just about all types, from warships like herself to ocean liners such as RMS Queen Mary. Savannah's part began on November 13, 1945, with her first journey to Le Havre, France, to bring U.S. service members home. Picking up over 1,400 officers and enlisted men, she made her way back to the U.S., arriving on the 28th in New York Harbor. Savannah later made another such journey, safely bringing men home. By December of 1945, she was sent for reactivation in the Philadelphia Naval Yard. The order was to remove equipment that could be either put in storage or placed on other ships. She was officially placed in reserve the following April. Her decommissioning took place on February 3, 1947. She remained in that state until being sold for $172,090 to the Bethlehem Steel Company on January 6, 1960. Savannah accrued 3 battle stars for her wartime service. She was commanded by 14 commanding officers during her career. While not as widely known as other famous U.S. Navy warships from the Second World War, Savannah garnered a reputation of reliable service and calm professionalism among circles of U.S. Navy commander staff during the war. Since this presenter's hometown is Savannah, Georgia, it was irresistible to get as close as possible to where the ship was moored during her first visit there. Going down to the riverfront in the historic district broke the fourth wall that so often exists between historical events and present observers. To learn more about Savannah, or Savannah, Georgia's maritime history in general, a sure bet is to visit the Ships of the Sea Museum located in the city's historic district. Neither this presenter nor the video is in any affiliated with the museum, nor is the script sponsored by them, but they deserve a sincere shout out for all the help they gave the presenter in researching Savannah's story. The museum's selection of artifacts can be seen in the pictures provided. Exhibits periodically rotate and include new items for public viewing. The location itself and the beautiful building in which the museum is housed also merit praise and a visit. Any visit to Savannah must include River Street, where one can find a small memorial to USS Savannah, as well as to other ships bearing the name of the city. There is a handsome fountain there. The presenter wishes to thank Derek and Eleanor for allowing him to provide this to you, and lastly, thanks to all the presenter's fellow Shipwreck Armada members. It was an honor to bring this story to you. Wishes are included for everyone watching. All the best and take care. Warmest regards, Skallace.